Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shib, or Shib for short. Appreciate you being here today. Goal of this video is to dive further into the Shadow Necromancer build, this tanky damage over time build. We are going to discuss where I'm taking the Paragon board, what kind of legendary aspects I'm using now, and how it's faring in the end game. Spoiler alert, it's faring really, really good. Taking for 120, 130K!
I'm not ready yet.
Oh! Face tank it while this is up. He does so much more damage to barriers. It sucks. Suck it! So I don't want to walk through this entire build because I did do so in the last video and that's just very redundant. So if you want to get a description for that, go look at that build, link down in the description below. For now, I'm just going to whip through this tree so you can see the skills I've selected if you're in a pinch and you want to select the same. Moral of the story is we want to build as much shadow damage over time as we possibly can because it synergizes with our Paragon tree. The more shadow damage over time we do in the faster time slot, the more damage that the enemy receives, and it scales as such to the point where I'm hitting up to 200k per second on bosses, which may not seem large, but over time and having that consistently apply is unbelievably strong, and you'll see so in some of these clips. I use corpse tendrils because I just want to stun the enemies on top of the shadow miasma as much as possible, stacking shadow damage, and then a little bit of tankiness with every single time you fortify every single time you generate a corpse. Outside of that, we're using a lot of the sacrifice bonuses from getting rid of all of our minions and just making ourselves as beefy as possible. We choose to use the Bone Storm ultimate because there is a legendary aspect that makes it so Bone Storm turns into a shadow damage over time effect, consistently staying with how we want this build to shake out. You're going to pick the Shadow Blight key passive here. And the reason we want to select this is because it scales heavily with a lot of the aspects we choose on our equipment, and I'll show you what those are. I will consistently say this build is a work in progress because although it's doing insane damage and performing perfectly for me in any of these high tier nightmares, 40s, etc. at level 74, I can only imagine where it could eventually get to if I perfected it. So here's what I got so far. Damaging an elite gives you a barrier, just strong. It's really just a strong thing to have as you get into tier 4. It's going to be a lifesaver for you. Heal for a certain amount based on the amount of enemies that are close by to you. I find this to be pretty strong, but it could be replaced with something else. I think this is a necessity for this build. It's the Howl from Below Sacred Unique Gloves. It makes it so your corpse explosions actually run at the enemy and leave the explosion miasma directly under the enemy, stacking that damage over time exactly where you want it to be. Each time Bone Storm damages an enemy, it gains a barrier of 4% of your maximum life. You pop your Bone Storm in any fight and you will be unkillable because it'll be taking damage and giving you 4% barrier consistently all around you, constantly at 100% barrier. It makes you immune. Blights defile the area when spawn pulls enemies in the affected area. Just another centralized pull them back into the shadow damage aspect that you have, and I put it on the boots because boots really don't get too many crazy aspects. Moving over to where our scaling really starts taking into effect. You deal 170% increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages an enemy 10 times. So the more you can stack that shadow damage over time on a boss or on an elite, the stronger you become, and it scales intensely and immensely. As well as additionally, each time the Shadow Blight key passive deals damage to enemies, it increases the next Shadow Blight damage within 10 seconds by 36%, stacking up to 5 times, which is roughly what, 210% on your Shadow Blight key passive, dealing just another chunk of damage that's constantly applying. So every single one of these ticks is growing due to our, you'll see soon during our Paragon board, but on top of that, you're also scaling your key passive damage and the damage you do from your shadow damage in general. This is what I was talking about. This is where your Bone Storm now becomes a darkness skill. This is a crucial aspect of this build because now you'll also do damage over time. See, as you can see, your Bone Storm takes 770% shadow damage over 2 seconds every single tick. So these minions are also taking another source of shadow damage over time while you're fighting them, while you're tanking up from the ultimate. It's just so synergistic and so strong. And then lastly, I really like running a shield here because you gain 0.4 armor for 4 seconds when you deal any sort of damage. So if I'm damaging massive enemies around all the time, I'm just constantly at that fully stacked armor, making me even beefier. And then for my ultimate, for my weapon, I like using knives. I think it's synergistic with how fast you're able to use Corpse Explosion, but also you deal increased damage standing still. This build allows you to be completely stationary. So you'll see in a lot of these clips of my fights, I'm just standing still, blowing up Corpse Explosions around me, increasing my shadow damage over time to everyone near me, up to 30% increased damage. And that's not even obviously at the peak of the imprint. I can make it have 10% increased damage, getting it to 40%, I believe, total damage increased by staying stationary. For my Book of the Dead, I'm going to sacrifice the Reapers, giving me shadow damage. I'm going to sacrifice the Cold Mages because it increases my vulnerable damage, which is applied from my Corpse Tendrils. And then Golems, I'm going to sacrifice Bone because it increases attack speed, which is just good for using that Corpse Explosion. It makes it so you can Corpse Explode as fast as you can click the button. All right, so let's talk about the Paragon board, and this can get a little crazy. The one thing I like to tell people that join up on stream is that everyone's Paragon board is going to look a little different, so you can take some advice from my board, but do not freak out if it's going to vary slightly because it's very dependent on the stats you have on your equipment, the stats you have on your character, what kind of glyphs you get, and what glyphs you've leveled up. So let me explain what I've done and why I've done it. First board is generic for all Necromancers, and I climbed up the right side to get extra damage because I'm a greedy mother effer. You're moving forward, I increased maximum life. I went up to the first glyph slot and I chose to go with this glyph that makes it so it grants 70% bonus to all rare nodes within the range. The reason I chose this slot here is because this is one of the very few glyphs that's going to have 2 rare nodes very close to it. So I kind of tailored the first board to help me there because here's why. It increases the stats by up to 70%. So as you can see, before I put that node in there, this is at 20% damage, 10 intelligence, and an additional 10% damage, right? And this one's at 200 armor and 10 intelligence. Well, now let me drop in this glyph over here, the one that I'm talking about, and look what happens. My damage is increased by 14% and an additional 7 on the bonus. And over here, my armor is now at 340 with 17 plus an additional 70 on the armor for the bonus. This is just a really strong glyph, and I think it's underutilized. I haven't really watched much videos. I'm curious to see if other people are doing the same thing, but this is kind of what I like to select on the first board. Now we're going to get into our legendaries, what we're gunning for. I don't want to guide you too much, but like I said, you're going to definitely want to try to get Wither. This just makes it so your shadow damage over time can scale indefinitely, and it improves based on willpower. I highly suggest speccing into this, and you'll see your damage greatly increase. Flying forward, I also grab the damage over time affected by shadow damage over time, or 20 damage to affected by shadow damage over time enemies, since our build is heavily reliant on that. Very strong, plus an additional 10 damage to those affected. I make sure I hit the amount of dexterity by adding additional points down here in the first node, keeping everything tight so I don't have to branch too far to reach all these different dexterity nodes. And then over here, 20% increased shadow damage over time, plus 10% shadow damage. And then you get another 10% shadow damage if you have the correct amount of intelligence, which honestly, inherently, if you ever have something that's your base stat, a bonus that's from your base stat, it'll almost always land. So I didn't have to do too much here to get that additional 10% shadow damage over time. Climbed up on the left side to get 20% shadow damage and then an additional 10%. But I went over here also because it has an additional glyph where I was lucky enough to find a straight up shadow damage glyph, and it also increases based on the amount of willpower. So you get 5.5 increased shadow damage per willpower I grab. So as you can see in each one of these willpower nodes, I also have 5.5% increased shadow damage. So that's why I'm grabbing all these extra willpowers in the node, and it works great there. Climbing forward, I have no additional points, but the plan is to immediately spin the board to get towards Flesh Eater because this is going to increase our damage dramatically. It's going to make it so every 5 corpses we consume, we get 40% increased damage for 6 seconds. And since we're consuming corpses all of the time, this is only going to scale our damage. And I think there's a lot of good nodes to grab on this first board to help you before you hit this ultimate node that's going to make you just an absolute beast. I'll run through the screen here one more time so you can just get a visual of it, of how I've climbed. Like I said, I branch out on some of these just to hit the bonus nodes for some of these rares, but I think this build is going to be insane and stronger and stronger. Like I said, I'm still developing this thing. I think this thing is amazing. So please let me know what you think down in the comments below. So let's keep crafting this thing and see what we can do with it. So that's going to do it for the build video for today. If you like this kind of content, hitting the subscribe button down below, coming over to Twitch and hitting the follow button means a lot and goes a long way for me. The goal of these videos now in the future is to dive through how I'm going to make all these builds turn into endgame and where I'm kind of taking the builds to ensure they're going to work as you get into those super high endgame tier 4 dungeons to make sure that you're going to live and be strong, outputting a bunch of damage. Stick around and I will see you guys very soon.